secular research and medical research on forgiveness. And I stopped at about 30, Adam, of listing the diseases that have been scientifically proven to be linked and exacerbated, if not caused in some ways, by unforgiveness.
Right.
From diabetes to cardiovascular disease to autoimmune problems to high blood pressure, on and on and on. And when you think about it, it's because
Welcome to the Making Sense of Faith podcast. I'm so thrilled today to have with me Dr. Henry Cloud. Many of you have read his books. In fact, Dr. Cloud, I have to tell you, this is my first book I got of yours right here. It's an old copy of it, 1992, original cover. And I've got several others as well. And we're going to be talking about forgiveness. Dr. Cloud is going to be speaking at Church of the Resurrection at the Forgiveness Summit at the end of May. And I'm thrilled to have a chance to interview him for a few minutes. Many of you know he's written 45 books, maybe more by now. Boundaries, which I held up a moment ago, different cover today, has sold over 20 million copies. He is a coach. He is a psychologist. He is somebody who's influenced a huge number of people. And I'm also glad to see that you and I graduated from the same, well, you graduated from college. I graduated from seminary at Southern Methodist University. And
wow.
Yeah. So we've been in Dallas for a little while together, not at the same time.
It was actually, in fact, I just wrote a book called Why I Believe, about my journey.
Yes.
Never had written anything personal. I always try to stay in my lane of my work, but it was in Perkins Chapel on a dark, rainy Sunday afternoon. I had left my dorm room, walked over to that chapel, and said, God, I don't know if you're there or not, but if you are, I need help. And that happened at Perkins.
That's awesome. Well, I have been in that chapel many times, both preached and listened and prayed many times myself. That's really awesome. That's amazing. Well, from there, so you were at SMU. From there, did you know that you were going to go into psychology while you were at SMU?
Gosh, no. I didn't know what psychology was. I had no idea. Well, to make it brief, I was recruited at SMU to play golf, and shortly thereafter I had a hand injury and my play was hampered, had a lot of pain, struggled with it for a couple of years, and ultimately had to quit. And when I quit, I got really depressed because that's pretty much all I'd ever done since I was a little kid, and so my life was over at 20. Have an existential crisis at 20, but I mean, it's the only life I knew, so it was a big deal. And I got really depressed. And as I said, one day I was in my dorm room, and my girlfriend and I had broken up. I was depressed. I didn't know what I was going to do with my life. How do you figure out a career? How am I ever going to find a job, make a living? And I'm worried about all this stuff. And I looked up on the shelf, and there was my little New Testament that I brought to college, hadn't read since I'd been in college. But I don't know, I just felt some sort of something. And I went over and picked it up, and I opened it up, and my eyes fell to this verse. It said, seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added to you as well. And that said to me, wait a minute, all these things I'm worried about, you look for God first, and then this falls into place? Really? Well, nothing else is working. So that's when I walked over to the chapel. And long story short, I just wrote a book about this called Why I Believe, because God stepped in, and there were some miraculous things that happened. And then I started healing through the depression and started studying a lot about. That's when I started kind of reading psychology. I was an accounting and finance major. God very specifically told me to change my major and go into psychology. I had no clue why. That's what happened.
Well, God could see what you couldn't see at that point. That's incredible. And you had grown up in the United Methodist Church in, was it Mississippi?
Yeah. Vicksburg, Mississippi. My parents were lifelong members. They mainly lived out their faith as, a lot of Methodists, in the Wesleyan tradition. It's so much rich goodness about social involvement and service, and they use their business to serve the poor and live their lives to serve the poor. So they were kind of good Southern Methodist folks, not in your face, very quiet about it, but very involved. So I didn't grow up in the, more ballistic
Right. Right.
Christian home,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
there
Yeah.
was a God part. I frankly, I always believed, but I never had jumped out of the plane, and with the full chute got open.
Yeah. Yeah. That's right. That's
So
great.
I did that in crisis. Yeah.
Well, and as many people do, and hearing Jesus speak through the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 6 is a very powerful word. Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and everything else will be added to you. Well, let's talk about forgiveness. So you're coming to Kansas City to talk about forgiveness, and I am curious, as you think about forgiveness and the work that you've done across your life. So I think about all of your books somehow. There's some, or at least the ones I've read, somehow tie in. There's some dimension to forgiveness, whether you're talking about boundaries or integrity or a whole host of things. When you think about forgiveness, why is it important for us to even talk about it? Where do you see this as a, so I'm going to back up. I think about Paul Tillich once said that forgiveness is the divine answer to the questions implied by our existence. This like, there's something inherent about us that needs forgiveness. We need God's forgiveness, but we need to learn how to forgive each other. From your take, where you stand, why is forgiveness important for us to talk about?
Well, I can answer it two ways. One is from where I stand. Where do I stand? Well, I'm a person, right? Trying to be. I had a patient one time that said, "Oh, I got to go be a person. That's really hard."
It is hard, isn't it?
Or I could answer it from where I stand as a psychologist, and as a psychologist, I've been in this for a long time. Forgiveness is an absolute essential for human thriving. Period. There are a lot of grudge holders that might be thriving in some areas, but you begin to look at the whole picture, and that negativity and hatred and vengefulness and bitterness that they hold on to, you'll see it come out. It manifests itself. And if it doesn't manifest itself externally, it manifests itself internally in the body and other mental health things. It's interesting. I just wrote about this. I wrote a book on trust, and trust gets, a lot of times trust, when people start to work on, a breakdown of trust, they have difficulty forgiving the person who betrayed them because they think, well, that means, you're saying I got to open myself up again. They're just going to hurt me again if I forgive them. Well, no, that's not true. And we can get into that. But the point is, in that book, I talked about how why it's so important. It's important for you and your functioning, much less the relationship getting healed. But one of the things I went into when I was doing the research on the book, one of the most comprehensive, prominent researchers on forgiveness, and I should have pulled up his name before we talked about this, but secular research and medical research on forgiveness. And I stopped at about 30, Adam, of listing the diseases that have been scientifically proven to be linked and exacerbated, if not caused in some ways, by unforgiveness.
Right.
From diabetes to cardiovascular disease to autoimmune problems to high blood pressure, on and on and on. And when you think about it, it's because, as Tillich said, it answers the question of our existence. Well, what is our existence about? We live in a fallen world that's where things are not as they ought to be. And that means I'm not as I ought to be. And I know that, even if I'm denying it, I know. And that creates a gap that creates negative physiological and psychological realities inside of my body. Adrenal functioning and all sorts of other stuff, high levels of cortisol. That's eating at my cells.
Yep.
Just my needing to be forgiven for things I don't feel good about.
Yep.
And we live in a fallen world where others are not as they ought to have treated us. And we have all of that crap inside of us.
Yeah.
And so when you think about it, why would you go to the dentist and say, don't touch the cavity, don't drill out all the infection. I want that bacteria in my system.
Right. Great metaphor. Yeah.
That's,
and yet we hold on to that. And it is like a cavity
Yeah,
that
we
eats away at us, isn't it? It just eats
Yeah.
away at our heart and mind and preoccupies our thinking when we're holding on to
Yeah,
that.
and you say, I'm not going to give this up until that candy bar says it's sorry for causing this cancer.
Exactly.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh,
Have a
man.
nice life. One of the things I'll talk about is, in life, we take in experience as we go through the day, as we go through the years, as we go through the, decades. We ingest experience. And just like when you ingest food, your body breaks it down and metabolizes it. It keeps what's useful. It eliminates the waste.
Right.
Right? So you can go on. Well, as we ingest experiences we have in relationships, and we take these in, and some of them are good, and some of them are bad, and some of them are mixed, and we're taking all this in, we've got to metabolize it, and the good stuff from those experiences we keep and turn into wisdom and strength and new ways of being and new behaviors we learned and skills and all of that, and muscles that we didn't have. But we got to eliminate what's not useful.
Now, I got to say, this is the most interesting metaphor I've ever heard for forgiveness. That is, we have to excrete out all the bad stuff. Let go of the bitterness and the resentment. Yeah.
Exactly. Now, you think about this. What do you do with waste? If you hold on to it,
Toxic.
you're going to it's toxic. Ultimately, It can kill you. And when you get rid of waste, where do you leave it? Hopefully, you're walking that way and the waste gets left behind, so you don't step in it in your future steps.
That's really good. That's a great.
A lot of people are walking backwards through life, and they're stepping in what they're carrying from yesterday.
Yeah.
And God has given us plumbing systems, 2 of them. One has to do with pain and grief and how we're wounded in all this. And that's called grieving and mourning. The other has to do with justice and the anger and resentment and what people owe us and what we want to extract from that. And that's forgiveness. So forgiveness and grief it's like the plumbing system that God has wired into us. And we got to get this stuff out of us.
Yeah, that's really good. Okay, so what are the tips that you've found most helpful when it comes to, because I think a lot of people would say, yes, I want to get it out of me. I want to get it out of me. I don't want to hold on to it. I want to let it go. But man, I can't let it go. So when you think about tips for, guidance that you give to people to say, okay, here's some things to try to help you be able to let it go, particularly when the other person hasn't asked for forgiveness. So now we're talking about
what if they're dead?
Or if they're dead, exactly. They can't ask for forgiveness anymore. Right.
Yeah. Are you stuck forever then? No,
Right.
Forgiveness only takes one person. Now, reconciliation takes 2. If you're going to get back and have a good relationship, they got to come to the table and do some stuff. But forgiveness is basically, look at the business metaphor. In fact, in the Bible, the idea is canceling a debt. Okay. Somebody hurts you. Justice says they owe you. That's where an eye for an eye. They took your eye out, they owe you yours or theirs. That's justice. And so we all have a sense of, you hurt me, you owe me. And part of the resentment is we want to extract that out of them or punish them in some way, the vengeance that we have for what you did to me and what you owe me. It's basically a debt. You owe me. Now, here's the problem. Two problems, actually. We can't collect on it. How is somebody going to undo what they did? How are they going to not do that in the past? First of all, it's uncollectible. Now, what does a business do when they have what they call bad debt? Debt they will never be able to collect. They have to get it off of their balance sheet. They write it off because it's a cancer on the strength of the business.
Mm-hmm.
You let it go.
Right.
Same thing with a person.
Right. That ties in to the, two of the words for forgiveness in Scripture. Nasa is one of the Hebrew words for Scripture, for forgiveness in Scripture. It means to lift off or to carry away. And that has some merit when you're thinking about either God helping you lift off or carry away that burden. But in the New Testament, ephiemi is the Greek word, and it means to release, to let go. And so just simple, like, as you're talking about writing off a debt, you're releasing it, you're letting it go. But still not always, it's easier said than done. It's easy to go, yeah, I want to do that. I just keep playing with this in my head. I keep holding on to it in my heart. What do you find helpful?
Well, there's a couple of things. One is, and this is not exactly accurate, we know, but there's some truth to it. If you think of the stages of grief, there's, first of all, the shock and denial. No, this can't happen. And then there's a protest where we really protest. This shouldn't have happened. This is awful and all that. But then when you realize at some point, if we've lost somebody there, we got to get to the point where we actually acknowledge, yeah, they're gone. We stop protesting and we grieve. We get in the pain of it. Pain is resolvable. Grief is resolvable. Bitterness isn't. So part of, if somebody's hurt me, I've got to realize, it's over. There's nothing it can do. And then get into how did it actually hurt? See, unforgiveness is a strong emotion. It's a protest. We're in the power position. Healing comes from the weak position, where we've let go of the protest of you owe me and you shouldn't have and it shouldn't be, to where we fall into, but it is. And what did it feel like to be hurt like that? And it's awful. And we get into the pain. That's resolvable. Pain is resolvable, can be healed. Unforgiveness can't. It's got to be released. So that's part of it. And when people begin to experience, if I'm abused or abandoned or whatever it is, expressing the pain and getting healed from the wound, that's part of, then I can let it go. That's part of it. Another big part of it, this is a big, big, big part of it, and a lot of times we don't want to hear this, is the biggest forgivers are the people who realize they've been forgiven.
Yeah, that's right.
Jesus said, this is scary. He said, and even in the Lord's Prayer, now, if you listen to this as what it actually is, it is an equation.
Mm-hmm.
Father, forgive us as we forgive others. In other words, how much am I going to be forgiven?
It's a terrifying prayer. Yeah.
It is. I'm going to be forgiven in the same way I forgive. So if I'm holding on to something, the measure that we measure will be measured by And so when you start to realize, and that's where, Jesus said the same thing, um, about the woman who was she bathing his feet with her hair and perfume.
Yeah,
Was
yeah,
it
yeah,
Mary?
yeah, yeah,
Where he makes a statement, she who's been forgiven much loves much. And so part of my being able to forgive, or your being able to forgive, is how much have we really bent the knee to really understand what God has forgiven us.
yeah,
And some people go, well, I never did what he did. Well, Jesus said, if you've done it in your heart, you did.
yeah,
Or, that's like going into a courthouse and walking into a courtroom and, you embezzled $1 million and somebody else next door, they're on trial for something different. Try standing in front of the judge and saying, well, I didn't do what he did.
yeah, yeah.
It doesn't take care of our problem.
Well, to your point, the idea, I think of the woman who was brought before Jesus, caught in the act of adultery. Of course, they didn't bring the man before Jesus; they only brought the poor woman before Jesus. Jesus' response to all of the folks with their rocks in their hands, saying, "The one of you who's without sin, you cast the first stone." And slowly they all walk away. They drop their stones and walk away. I mean, there's something about recognizing our own. This is your point: is to recognize our own need for forgiveness, the magnitude of our brokenness. And we might not have done that, but we've done plenty of other things which allow us to be in a position to at least start that healing and to let go.
Yeah. Moral superiority is just a very sick, dressed up version of putrid narcissism. It doesn't look like the narcissist who's bragging about all their accomplishments in life, but it's a looking down on because you're assuming that you're morally superior to somebody. And Jesus was pretty clear about this land being level under the cross. And some of it's on the outside and some of it's on the inside. And he said the ones that acknowledge it are one step closer than the
Yeah.
ones who can't.
Let me ask you a question. We're living in a time that's, a hyper-polarized society. We're deeply divided over politics and a whole host of social issues. And somewhere in there, I think forgiveness, or we can talk about mercy, or these play some part in us in bringing us back together again. It seems, we see what each other posts on social media. We don't like what they post. Somebody posts something nasty about us. When we post something on social media. Talk about forgiveness when it comes to. Let's talk about social media, and then let's talk about politics.
Yeah, the social media thing is, gosh, talk about, well, I think just kind of illustrates everything in life that in some ways, kind of almost everything in creation is designed to be good, but it can be used for evil, right? But it's unbelievable how much hatred is in people's hearts, that they're just ready to go attack somebody for saying something. But I had an experience. I didn't do it. My team did it, but I had made a statement in some book or in a talk or something, and it said, compassion is really good for relationships. Try some.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I said. I was bombarded with hate mail by a certain group that said, you're telling me to show compassion to my narcissistic, abusive, whoever, husband, wife, parent, whatever, and telling me to get abused again. I didn't say anything like that.
Right.
But it's sort of like something that can be used to go, having an issue with somebody. And it's horrible out there. And a lot of it you're talking about forgiveness, but a lot of it, has to do with our first examining what is in my heart.
Mm-hmm.
What am I walking around with? Because even if I were trying to do what that person said I was trying to do in this post, which I wasn't, what they've got to do and what I've got to do and you've got to do, and we all have to do is stand on the ground and say, am I a person who seeks redemption in the earth, or am I a person who promotes everything else, judgment, anger, rage, unforgiveness, and all that? So if somebody does a post I don't like, then I've got to ask myself, do I want to go attack them, or do I want to, in some way, or is it my role? Is there some way I could be helpful?
Yep.
Could I maybe reach out to them and say, hey, you might want to include this so people don't feel this, or, but that's not what people are doing nowadays. They're not trying to be redemptive in their responses to each other. And in the whole, divide that you're talking about in the bigger picture, I have a lot of thoughts about that, but I know one of them is proximity, the right kind of proximity. I think that it's easy to attack people from a distance, but what I like to do with my friends and I've got some really close friends who have very different opinions on stuff, is to sit down and try to understand, like, how did you come to that conclusion? And not to try to ask them that so I can change them, but primarily out of curiosity.
Exactly.
And you start to hear people's stories, and some of what you thought was extreme starts to at least be understandable or make sense why they would hold that view. And then you can have a lot of compassion. And then we can talk about the issue because we're together, because we've empathized and listened to one another.
So huge. It's so important. And social media doesn't really lend itself to that. You have to be able to put on the brakes and say, wait a minute, I'm angry and agitated. I'm going to type some zinger to somebody, as opposed to going what you just said, to actually say, I wonder, I'd like to know more about why they hold this view. I don't want to assume the worst about them. But that comes in, as you said, proximity. And that's true on almost all divisive issues too. When we're proximate to people who are in a different place than we are, we often will find places of agreement, but we also see their humanity, as opposed to, firing away some missive that ends up dividing us further rather than bringing us together.
Yeah, I was talking to one of my daughters yesterday, in fact, and somebody had treated somebody she's close to very poorly, and then she saw that person, and she was kind of like, "Argh." I kind of wanted to go after him because of how they had treated her, and she made a joke. She goes, "But then I am a huge grudge holder." She made it as a joke. And I said, "Liz, don't hold grudges. Not good for you." She goes, "I know, Dad." And she told me a story. She said, and she saw this as passive aggressive as it was. She said, "I remember one time I was in the 8th grade, and there was this mean girl at school, and she was being mean and this, that, and the other. And I walked up to her and I said, I'm going to pray for you." And she goes, "Why?" And she said, and I told her, "Because my dad told me I had to pray for my enemies." I go, that's not exactly the spirit with which we laughed about it, but
Yeah.
it's important.
Yeah.
It's important.
Yeah. Well, I do find praying for people, when somebody's frustrated you or irritated you, and you pray for them. And I've had people who, hurt me deeply at points in the past. And as I begin to pray for them, as opposed to getting back at them, at first I pray with a clenched jaw, and I'm still holding on to that. But eventually, if I pray for God's blessings for them, for God's care for them, the prayer from my lips works its way into my heart, and I find myself actually having empathy and concern for them, and seen how it changes. And Jesus is the one who gives us that advice. He's the one who tells us to pray, for those who wrong us and persecute us or hurt us. And I find the people on the other side of the political aisle or whatever it is, they're not really our enemies. They're fellow human beings, and often they're fellow Americans most of the time. Anyway, hey, I want to wrap it up by asking you about marriage and forgiveness. How important it is in marriage. And I'll just start off by saying I've been married 43 years. It's almost a daily occurrence for some tiny little slight, some little, not daily, but, some little thing that I'll say or my wife will say, or we'll be short with each other or something else. And so that's critical in those cases, but it's critical when things get a little harder too. So talk a little bit about forgiveness in marriage. Any thoughts on that?
Thank God it exists, right? Well, think about it this way. Unless you're married to Jesus, you're going to need it.
Unless you're married to Jesus, you're going to need forgiveness.
Yeah. Because you're married to an imperfect person who is going to, large or small, medium size, whatever, they will fail you. Okay? So there's a verse in Hebrews that says, don't fall short of the grace of God. Let any root of bitterness, grow up. When something hurts us, if we are going to hold on to it, unforgiveness, think about this. Unforgiveness is, by definition, an adversarial position. We have something against someone. Okay? When you're married, you are one. In fact, Paul says this, when you don't love your wife, you don't love yourself. Because it's an autoimmune disease. And when you're holding on to something against a spouse, you're creating division in the most important relationship that you have. A. B, you're missing out on all of the good things that you could have because you're holding on to something and you're distancing and you won't talk to them, you give them the silent treatment or whatever it is we're doing. But it's just a, as you said, daily, we just have to have a stance. God uses the phrase, a standing in grace. We're not in grace and fall out of it. Paul says we stand in it. So I think it's cool in marriage. And John Gottman, the marriage researcher, says that the greatest marriages exist in this bubble of trust, is the way that he puts it. And this bubble of trust and psychological safety, or whatever you want to call that, where even our failures are going to find redemption, provided, certain things happen, of course. But if you hold on to stuff, you're just hurting yourself and you're hurting the relationship and you're preventing things from getting good. Now that's on like real infractions. Some big percentage of this stuff is not even on real infractions. It's on something that we deem as an infraction. It's a preference, it's an expectation, or it may be they did something neutral that triggers a real infraction that we had maybe from a long time ago with a parent or an abuser.
Yeah.
And so they did something, they're not trying to do anything wrong, and they didn't objectively do anything wrong, but it triggered something. So now we're talking about not forgiving for something that even God and the Beverly Hillbillies would not call a big deal.
There you go. Okay, I want to ask you. You mentioned in our earlier conversation before we joined on the podcast the issue of trust and trust versus forgiveness, or forgiveness versus trust. You want to say just a word about that?
Yeah, a lot of times, so I just wrote a book on trust, and um, a lot of times when you're talking to somebody about forgiveness, what they'll immediately do is they'll equate forgiveness and trust. When I say, we're not going to get anywhere, like let's just take a couple, for example. Let's say it's been you know, some sort of betrayal. Okay. Um, but they want to work on the marriage. And you start talking about, well, at some point we gotta be talking about forgiveness so we can get to a better future. Because that happened in the past. We don't let this go, keep taking it in the future, we got a problem, right? So we gotta talk about how you're gonna forgive this person. And a lot of times, and rightly so, they will say, well, I can't trust him after that. So you're telling me I got to open myself up and just trust him, forgive him, and just let him back in, and what if it happens again? And they equate forgiveness with trust. Very important to make a distinction. Forgiveness has to do with something that's already happened. It has to do with the past. It's free. By definition, you can't earn forgiveness. A debt that's forgiven is a debt that isn't paid off. It's a gift. It's free. It cost the giver. They're the ones that pay for it.
Right.
So forgiveness is something you let go of in the past. That doesn't mean that I have to trust you yet, because trust is not free. Trust is earned. Trust is about the future, what I'm going to make myself carelessly vulnerable with in your hands to hurt me again, potentially. We trust somebody when we can be hurt by them. And I'm not going to do that until I've seen A, B, C, D, E, F, G.
Right.
But that doesn't mean I can't forgive you for what happened before.
Right.
You got a teenager and they've done something they shouldn't have done. Will you catch them? And, yeah, we got to work through forgiveness so they can live in the house and we all do well together. But you're not going to necessarily be using the car next week just
Right.
because I
Right.
forgive you.
Exactly. Well, and that points to the fact that, and I talked about this in my sermon this last Sunday, forgiveness doesn't mean eliminating consequences. Forgiveness doesn't mean saying whatever happened was okay. It's not excusing it, and it's not eliminating consequences. It's releasing your own anger, your own hurt, your
That's
own
right.
right to retribution. You're releasing that, but at the same time, the example I shared was a friend years ago who betrayed my confidence and told 5 or 6 other of his friends something I'd shared in confidence, and they told their friends, and they all told him, I'm sharing this in confidence, and it was not any huge big deal. And I forgave it instantly. I let it go. I just didn't share anything in confidence with that person again because I wasn't sure I could trust them, even though I had forgiven them, which is really what I hear you saying in this.
Yeah. And this is why it gets complicated, because you're saying, there were consequences to that. But part of that is you probably hadn't seen a lot of, close up view of how they understood that and changed and,
Right.
made a lot of progress there. But sometimes it actually, and this is weird, sometimes um, it is wiping out of the consequences in terms of that we don't make them pay for it.
Right. Right.
Now, the trust thing is different,
Yeah.
but
Yeah. Yeah. If you're using as something and holding it over their head, that's not forgiveness. That's
yeah. But at the same time, sometimes we want to hold somebody the consequences. For example, um, you do the crime, you pay the time. And sometimes somebody can be forgiven, but still got 6 months in jail, or they they got to pay off what they embezzled or something like that. And other times, people will forgive it, and there's reasons and there's context, and this stuff is not simple.
Yeah,
But what is simple is that we need to forgive.
absolutely. Hey, I want to wrap it up here and say thank you so much for spending time with me today. And I want to encourage all of you who are listening to this, join us for the Forgiveness Summit. This is going to be at Church of the Resurrection's Leawood location. It's May 30th and 31st. We have amazing speakers. Dr. Henry Cloud is one of those. It is going to be an opportunity. It's Friday evening, Saturday morning, an opportunity for us to think about together forgiveness, to get some practical tips and ideas, understanding of forgiveness, and be inspired to actually release or let go. And who doesn't need more of that in our lives? And our world desperately needs more of grace and forgiveness. And so, Dr. Cloud, thank you so much for joining me today.
Good to be with you. I look forward to the event.
Me too. Me too.
Thanks for tuning in to Making Sense of Faith with Adam Hamilton. Do you know someone wrestling with life's biggest questions? Share this episode with them, because the more people willing to embrace the hard questions, the better. Do you want to go deeper? You can visit makingsenseoffaith.com to find the show notes and additional resources. That's also where you can sign up to get the notes and resources delivered straight to your inbox. If you enjoyed this episode, hit subscribe and leave us a rating in your podcast player. That'll make sure that you get the latest episodes and help others find the podcast. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel. Hit that notification bell to catch future episodes and videos there. Until next time, remember that your questions matter. Doubts are normal, and making sense of faith is a lifelong journey. We'll see you on the next episode of Making Sense of Faith.